Okay, this is feedback for yuewu, and the question was, what do you think about these panels? I'm new to storytelling, not really sure what questions to ask. So, it's a pretty general question, so I will try to say what comes to my mind first. I guess when it comes to comic feedback, what you're looking for is storytelling tips, right? So flow is very important. Camera angle use, uh, the framing of the composition, they're all very important. And I see the intent that you have in some of these panels, for example, um, using camera angle to show vulnerability, looking down and then looking up, using framing to focus on specific parts of the body that you want the viewers to to look at, and then using framing to show an intruding new objects or elements into the story by using out of bounds kind of space here, uh, different like camera tilt to give yourself space for flow of dialogue. So all that is very good. There are some things to keep in mind. So when it comes to flow, uh, an important thing is not only um, the flow within the panel, but the flow from panel to panel as well. And another thing is that flow also affects speech bubbles, not just the art. This is one thing that I noticed that a lot of comic artists don't care about, but I care about it, so I want to share my thoughts on something like that. When you're trying to show a reader which sides to read first, you said reading right to left, so from here to here. It's not just the rules that should guide the viewers. You want to make it really hard for the viewers, for the readers to read it in the wrong direction. So even though from right to left, supposedly you're supposed to read this first and then you read this, right? But they are equal eye level, and furthermore, this is higher up than this. When you read right to left, there's also the assumed top to bottom reading orientation. So when my eyes look at this panel, I might think, do I read this first? And then the logic comes in and tells me, no, based on logic, I'm supposed to read this first. But my eyes naturally want to follow this flow that you've created from here through their heads to this, to the car, to here, because my eyes not automatically want to read from top to bottom rather than from bottom to top. So in this case, the best thing to do is to move this down here and move this up here. And then the same thing for a lot of these frame the figures in a circular pattern. I actually don't know how I'm supposed to read this, because you start with the first bubble of a chain, right? So presumably this is the first because it's changed to the next here. But this goes against your rule of reading right to left. This is you breaking some parts of the rules and telling the readers again to use logic to deduce that they're supposed to start here and then go here and then what? Come here? Like this? Or is it supposed to be like this, right? So the top to bottom, left, right to left, there are many conflicting priorities that the readers have to decide. So you don't want to frame the dialogue this way. When I draw multi-level dialogue, I want to stack them. So I'm going to pretend the art isn't here, just for the sake of talking about dialogue. I want to stack them. So right to left or not, I would do this so that it's extremely clear that you clearly start from here, because not only is this is the topmost dialogue, and then if I want to be super clear, I want to put this here. So this would be the new speech bubble, top to bottom, right to left, right? Both will follow the rules. I'm assuming the next bubble is this one, so I will put this here. And then I would probably want to put these two here, since that's the next one, I believe. And then these two down here. And this makes for a terrible dialogue layout because it overlaps a lot of the arts in order to put them next to each other. So you can tell that because of this, you can't have a frame with subjects in the center while they are having a conversation, because it forces your dialogue to go like this and it reads terribly. Then it's best to maybe slant this this camera angle even more so that you can fit all of these on one side so that the reading order is much clearer. Let me find an example. I did something similar in the current volume of Carsophona, although I don't know how quickly I can find it. So in these pages, right, there are a lot of people talking, and there's a lot of space that they're moving around in. Here I made sure that there's space in between them for the dialogue, and then here as well, space on top around the characters for the dialogue. No matter what, top to bottom, right to left, one single line. There's no zigzag across the characters. There's no choice that people have to make, and that's something that you want to be able to do for your dialogue. You don't want people to have to figure out, see again here, dialogue in between the characters since they're standing far apart enough. And the way that I did this is, I think what I assume is you drew the art first, and then you try to put the speech bubbles in, because the speech bubbles look sort of like an afterthought of the composition. When I mentally remove all of the speech bubbles, each panel look like a complete piece of art. There's not much negative space, empty space. It doesn't look empty at all. If anything, the speech bubbles look like they don't have space for themselves. So what I would suggest that you should do, or you could do, is to put in the text first so that you know in what flow your text needs to be. So for instance, if I open the page that I just showed you, this page, if I only show the text and I delete everything else, what I made sure was that it looked sort of like this. And then I knew these were separate, but like the text themselves, right? The text themselves follow these lines. And then, okay, I can draw around them. And then if I find that there's no space or art because of all this text, then that's when I would remove some of the text so that there is space. Like bump up the panel count, move things to the next page so that there's space for the art. But first and foremost, in my opinion, you need to put down the text first. If you don't, you're going to end up with this situation where you have to find space for the text and it becomes really hard to read. Same thing here. You've drawn great frames. If I just delete the text, they each are great frames, especially apparent if there's no text in that frame due to the action. But it's when you put the text in, they seem like intrusive. They're blocking important things. They're taking up space where they shouldn't, where you had planned for visuals. So try to put in text first and think of this flow of the text. Again, here, based on your right to left rule, I would know that to read this first, but because they're even and then this text is below this, I would have instinctively wanted to read this first. So something like this would be much better. And then if you feel like, well, there's a lot of empty space here, then it might be even better to just do this and then move him to the right. If you had put down the text first, then you would have been able to draw him with the text being taken into account and know that if you moved him a little bit to the side, this panel will be very balanced. A good thing to check for whether or not you are taking text into account when you are doing layouts is to remove the text. This is like a test you can do after the fact. If you remove the text and it looks like your page is missing something, that's a good thing because it means that your text belongs in the composition. It means that your composition is complete with the text. You don't want the composition to be complete without the text because once you add the text, it would be too much. So if you look at the page that I just had, if I remove the speech bubbles, there's a lot of empty holes here. I would feel like I want to center her. I would feel like I want to move them closer to the center, make them bigger so that the people are looking at her, right? I would want to move her, give her more space here so that, the composition of the panel looks better. But when I put all these text in, they fit in because they have to belong in there. So that's one thing about the text. The other thing that I wanted to talk about with the flow is when you do camera angles, there are some foundation rules that you should keep in mind. I don't really know the rules too well myself, but the one that I follow is like the 180 rule, where you don't spin your camera around more than 180 degrees. So I don't know how to explain this. So I am in a game right now, and maybe I can use my game to show you. So if I am the camera like this, and I'm trying to show two people talking. Person one is sitting here, person two is sitting here. In the camera framing, during the conversation, at most you want to do this and this. You don't want to suddenly be on the other side of the table and do this where you flip them around. And when you're looking at them, person two is looking to their right, our left. You don't want to make them face their left, our right, the other way around. Doing so kind of throws off the setting. It makes the scene harder to follow. And even if you go into like an overhead kind of view or an ant's eye kind of view, you still want to point at about the same place. So when it came to this panel, these panels, the previous page, you had them in the back. There's facing the back, there's facing the front, there's facing the left, and then there's swinging this around front again, and then top down with no specific angle, just like the camera is right above the person. And then when you are taking this shot of the foot, and the foot is just sideways, there's no relation to the previous panels angles. I can't really quite tell in what direction they slipped, in what direction they fell. Where are there the other characters that was previously right next to them? Right? You want people to be able to keep track of all of that in their heads, and so you want to give them an easier time by keeping the camera still. So I guess if you wanted a different camera angle for this, since there's so many front views, I would suggest like a different camera angle of this top panel could have been something like this orange guy, hoodie person, and then woman, and then the other person. They're all walking this way. You're still facing the front-ish. They are walking to their left in terms of on paper. And they're facing the camera, facing us rather than facing away in terms of this piece of two-dimensional paper. So that makes it so that all of these people are still sort of facing the camera that is over here, is camera guy that's holding the camera, shooting, then which connects much better to this and then to this. And then maybe for I can't really tell what's going on here, but instead of having, I'm assuming like a shadow creeped up on them and scared them, instead of having a shadow be here so that you have to look at their back, maybe have them here and then have the shadow be in the super foreground, right? It suddenly shows up. They're still facing the correct direction, the same direction as before, and then there's also the element of the shadow being imposing because it's in the foreground, it's foreshortened and it's huge, and it looks like a threat because it's looms over the characters. So that's a bonus. And since she fell backwards, might make sense for this panel for her to be fallen backwards, slip like this. This is the front of her body. You can just draw the foot, it's fine. But like I'm just drawing this to show that she's falling backwards rather than just a side view of her foot. There's more continuity from here. And when she's on the ground, I would make this, instead of like top down view, this is the floor. I would make it a bit of a at least slanted so that again there's connection to the previous camera angle of this is the front where the shadow is coming from and this is the back, and we're still looking at them from this way rather than from this way, right? And all of these is connected, and finally when the adversary shows up, the camera can finally turn around and we see from their perspective at this new thing that's shown up. So all of these changes would have kept the camera stable, kept the viewer's idea of what is happening in the scene, what is where in the scene, stable, and makes the story a lot easier to understand. One last thing that I want to talk about is your choice of shots. So in dialogue, that's quite hard to do because one would want to focus on faces, facial expressions a lot. And what better way to show faces than a portrait, right? But over time, it becomes quite monotonous where it's just portraits and portraits from the same angle and person slightly moving. It Comics differ from animation this way in that comics don't move, and you look at each frame. If you just look at each frame, you don't really perceive action as much as if it were an animation. In this case, that makes it harder for the motion to come through, and it looks more like you don't know how else to portray the scene. So one way to do this is to think about more than just facial expression when it comes to expression. Like the cop guy is using his arms to express himself. The lady that's crying is using her hands to express herself. There are things that you could notice that people do on that's more than just moving their hands and moving their faces. If somebody is nervous, maybe they have a tic. Maybe they are more tense. They, instead of their hands being at their sides, they might hold a fist subconsciously. That is what I. Let me see. I don't know if you can tell, I guess, or I don't know if you mind Cruciform spoilers. If you do, skip this part. But here they are very nervous about Blackbird, and when Blackbird is standing, I made the difference between her and Velus's postures because they are quite composed even in very tense situations. Their hands are relaxed. But when the others are here, they have fists. I don't know where I drew them, but I remember that I did. They have fists. They're nervous. The way that they hold themselves, their body language is different. They stand taller. They're alert. They're the way that they leave their arms on their sides, for example, might be there to try to make them bigger. Body posture shifts, crossing their arms, tilting their heads, stuff like that. A lot of those smaller things can be used to express oneself, and the whole point of those is you can focus on those parts of their bodies rather than the face if you run out of things to put into a panel. If there are several repeated panels of faces, if he's looking down and he's feeling bad or he's thinking, you might show a slightly bigger. I'm not going to think about dialogue for now or space for the dialogue for now. I might put it here, like do with the cigar. I might want to show his mind by putting his hand in his jacket for a bit, and I show this crop to make people look at him putting his hands in his jacket. And if I think that's not enough, I might crop out his eyes, because eyes are the first things that people look at and they're very distracting. So I crop out his face so people don't look at it, and I want them make them look at his arms instead. And then lady says, "What's wrong?" And I don't show his face, and I show whatever else he's doing with his arms, like fidgeting, whatever. These kind of things varies up the panels, but also makes people look at different parts of a person for expression. It makes people look for clues when they're reading the story to figure out what mood the story is conveying right now, and makes the visuals more have more variation, more flavor. It's not just dialogue. Um, Same thing here. Hand movement. It's not just people speaking and faces changing. It should be like if they are about to hug, then maybe she could raise her hands in anticipation in this panel, or you could make her walk forward, right? You have us as your family. She is trying to she's trying to be welcoming. So I don't think a full body would be good here, but just as an example. A little bit of a walking forward, a little step forward. It's a very open gesture, very comforting gesture, right? I want to put more of her into the panel so that I can draw what she's doing in the rest of the panel, and that links to this hug that's that happens and makes it seem less abrupt. Moving from a pose to another, or moving towards the next action. That's always something that you could use to add different flavors to your long conversations. And one thing that I do like to think about is what they're doing when they're talking. It's one reason why I make Blackbirds very expressive. She's a lot easier to draw than a lot of other people. Saint doesn't really move much. Velos doesn't move much. There are people who don't use their body language to speak very much. Chris moves a lot, so he points, he steps forward, he does all sorts of different things. But like even here, they can be exchanging threats. This could all be shown in a scene where they do nothing. They just talk to each other. And that happens in anime and manga and comics a lot. They just stand there and they talk and you see their faces a lot. But I made sure to give them something to do. Like I put Blackbird somewhere so that she has a reason to move away from that place. She's sitting at the windowsill. She is coming up with a proposition, and as always, she likes to impose on people's space and make you feel like you have a deadline to answer her question or stop her advance. So she gets off, she walks towards Velas, she makes all these little movements, shifting her hands, swinging the necklace. All these things I could have just not done, and I think a lot of people wouldn't care or think that there's anything wrong. But for the sake of not having just plain portraits for the entire conversation, that's what I chose to do. And even then, I had very little to show for Velas because she is not like Blackbird. She doesn't move. So her panels end up being like just minor shifts in expression, which is not very great, until the next page where I could give her something to do. And then same thing for for the parts that's before this. Right, there's a lot of conversation here. Again, I make her look away, I make her tilt her head, I make her cross her arms and do all of these things. Um, different zoom, different angles, but always facing the same direction. Like I don't turn the camera too much. Like minor movements, just walking to a wall to put her hand on, put her face in her arms. That allows me to have a lot more variety in coming up with things to draw into the panel for a conversation. So these are the things that I consciously do in order to have have flavor. Same thing here. I would try to show shifts in her body language by cutting off her face from the panel, by showing her stance, showing her foot stance, very grounded stance versus relaxed and stuff in terms of talking about what they're speaking of. Um, parts where I show that she's looking down, that she is like a little bit sulking kind of pose, like small, reserved, inward looking. Um, these are the things that I do to give kind of variety, and you could try to think that way when you write these dialogue, and it'll allow you to have way more things to work with for drawing, coming up with layouts for your comic.